So you meet a friend in the middle of Burton and you get chatting, and in the course of your conversation you say, I really like living here. Look at these beautiful old buildings. And your friend says, all of this is going to be pulled down. Nothing will be left. And you say, well, yeah, eventually. Nothing lasts forever. But your friend says, no, not eventually. Soon, in this generation. And that would be a huge shock. And it's not just about the loss of beautiful old buildings, because the question would be going through your mind, what's this going to mean for the people of our village? Well, imagine something even more shocking. The same conversation happening in the middle of London. You're admiring the Houses of Parliament and Big Ben and Westminster Abbey, and your friend says, all of this is going to be pulled down. Not one stone here will be left on another, and soon, in our generation. And the reason that's a bigger shock, even though it's distant from us, these are the buildings of our government, of our nation. If we woke up one morning to the news that the buildings around Parliament Square had all been destroyed, it would be like the end of our world. What kind of terrifying conflict must have engulfed London for that to have happened? And are the laws of our land still in place? Are we safe? Can we still spend our British pounds? Will there be food in the shops even here? Will there be water in the taps? Or fuel at the garage? And that is the shock that Jesus delivers to his disciples. We've been hearing, as we've been reading through the book of Ezra, about the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple in the 6th century BC. That second temple was then enlarged by Herod the Great during Jesus' lifetime and ended up covering 36 acres, the whole complex, on the top of the highest part of Jerusalem. It was the largest temple complex in the ancient world. And Jesus, of course, as we've been reading in Matthew, he's been in that temple for this last week before his crucifixion. He's been warning them of the consequences of not receiving him as their king. But, as he's reminded them, they shed the blood of prophets in the past, and they're going to shed his blood as well. And so he says, chapter 23, verse 35, that upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed in the land. Jesus, in this chapter 24, declares that that temple will be reduced to rubble within a generation. And again, it's not just the loss of a beautiful, magnificent building. Every Jew would be asking, well, what is our nation if we don't have the temple? What is our nation if God doesn't live among us? What about the worship and the sacrifices that God has commanded? And all of our leaders, they rule from this temple complex. Who will rule over us now if all of that is going to be swept away? And every Christian there would be asking, well, what about us? What does this mean for us? Are we going to be caught up in all this terrifying devastation? Is he just going to leave us and ascend to the Father and as our world is falling apart? Storm clouds then gathering over Israel, but what will become of the people? And that's what Jesus has to teach us. How he will be vindicated and his disciples will stand firm, but it is his enemies that will be brought down. First of all, though, the question that the disciples ask Jesus when they hear this is there in verse 3. When will this happen? Chapter 24, verse 1. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. Do you see all these things? He asked. I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age. So as we've got here in this illustration, he and his disciples leave the temple, they descend into the Kidron Valley, and then up the other side onto the Mount of Olives, from which they would look over the temple that they've just been in, and where he's just spoken about all those stones being brought down. And so they ask him the question, so when? When will this happen? There are two parts to the question. When will these things happen? The destruction of the temple. And then it's clear that they're expecting a coming of Jesus. The word is parousia, an arrival, an appearance, which also they seem to be linking to something they're calling the end of the age, the close, the consummation of the present time. They want to know, what are the signs? What will be the signs that all this is about to happen? Well, what do you think? Do you think they're asking one question or two questions? Are they thinking in their minds about two different events here, or is it all one event? Some people say they're asking about two different things. The fall of the temple, which was, of course, destroyed 40 years later by the Romans, and then the other thing, the end of the world and the return of Jesus. And, of course, that hasn't happened yet. So is it two different things? And yet that's not a natural reading of the way they ask the question, is it? It appears in their mind that these things are all linked together. How can it be about one event? When you look at Jesus' answer, some of Jesus' words are about things that are very close to the people that he's speaking to. For example, Jesus keeps saying "you," as if he's warning those disciples that are there in front of him, not a generation thousands of years in the future. Verse 4, watch out that no one deceives you. Verse 6, you will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. And Jesus does the same thing in verse 9 and 15 and 20 and 23 and 25 and 26 and 33. You. And some of the details clearly relate to first century Judea and not to 21st century Britain. For example, verse 15, he talks about the holy place. Well, that is the Jerusalem temple. Verse 16, he talks about Judea by name. Verse 17, he talks about people who are on the roof of their house. That's not Britain. We don't tend to sit around up on the roof of our house, but of course they did on the flat roofs of their homes. And verse 20, it's a nation where the Sabbath is a big deal. And then the most clear statement of all, verse 34. I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. It seems to be about something that's very close in time and place to the people he's talking to. But what about the other things in the passage that seem to be about the end of the world and the return of Jesus? Verse 14, for example. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Verse 29 talks about the end of the sun and the moon and the stars. Verse 30, the Son of Man appearing in the sky, coming on the clouds, and all nations of the earth mourning. These details seem to be about the distant future, unless there's another straightforward, without mangling the text, another way of understanding what Jesus is saying here. And there is. Verse 14, first of all. That word, translated there, nations, is the Greek word ethnos, from which we get ethnic. It's a word that really means a people group, a nation, but not a modern kind of nation like the United Kingdom or the United States. And then the word translated world, well, there is another Greek word for world, cosmos, but it's not used here. The word here is the word that means the inhabited world, which for them is the Roman Empire. And pretty much that was the world that they thought about. Beyond the Roman Empire, well, there was nothing really of much significance to them in their minds. So it's not talking about China or America. It's the world that they knew, that inhabited world, the Roman Empire. So that verse is saying this gospel of the kingdom will be preached throughout the world, throughout the Roman Empire, as a testimony to all the peoples of that empire. And then the end of something, will come. Then look at verse 29, where we have the end of the sun and the moon and the stars. Well, I know we haven't seen the sun recently, but I'm confident it's still up there. And if you go out at night and it's not a cloudy night, the moon is there and the stars are there. So we naturally say this is a prophecy about something that hasn't happened yet. But that's because we don't know our Bibles very well. And help is coming on that. The Westminster Bible reading plan is arriving in a few weeks' time. There's a little note about it in the notices. I'll say more in a couple of weeks' time. We might get to know our Bibles better. But the point is that the heavenly bodies were created on day 4. It says to rule the day and the night. And all the way through the Bible, the heavenly bodies, the sun, the moon, and the stars, are symbols of earthly rulers. And when Jesus says these words, you see that there's a footnote telling you that you'll find them in Isaiah 13 and Isaiah 34. So Isaiah 13 verse 10 says, "The stars of heaven and their constellations will not show their light. The rising sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light." But when you look at Isaiah 13, what is being talked about is God bringing down Babylon and her rulers for all her arrogance. And it's described in these terms as the stars of heaven, the lights going out for Babylon. Similarly, Isaiah 34 says, "All the stars of the heavens will be dissolved and the sky rolled up like a scroll. All the starry host will fall like withered leaves from the vine." But it's not talking about the stars falling out of the sky. It's talking about judgment on another nation, Edom, the destruction of her rulers. So when Jesus uses that kind of language, it would be sensible to assume that he's talking about the same kind of event when that language was used in Isaiah. The eclipse of a great power, the downfall of rulers, the end of that world in which, as God sees it, Jerusalem was the center. What about verse 30? Surely this is got to be about the future return of Christ to our world, hasn't it? "At that time, the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory." But once again, we need to know our Bibles well. That is words taken from Daniel. In fact, if you keep a finger in Matthew and turn to Daniel 7, it's on page 892, you'll see where Jesus gets these words that he speaks. So page 892, Daniel 7. And we're going to hear about one called a Son of Man coming on the clouds. The question is, what is the direction of his travel? Is he coming to earth or something else? So this is page 892, Daniel 7, verse 13. "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." So, here's a Son of Man coming on the clouds, but there's no mention of him coming to earth, to the world. Rather, he's going to the Ancient of Days, to God. He's being led into God's presence and given all authority and glory and power. Back in Matthew 24 then, so as Jesus speaks these words, it's just a few days until his crucifixion and then his resurrection, and just a few weeks until his ascension when he leaves this world. And that Daniel 7 language is describing the other end of that journey. As Jesus arrives in heaven, is led into the presence of God his Father, and is given all authority and power and glory. It's the enthronement of Jesus in heaven, and the consequences of that will be seen on earth. Now, to take these passages that way, when we looked at this in home group the other day, this is known as a preterist or a preterist reading. That word just meaning past-ist. It means that you believe that many of the prophecies in the New Testament were prophecies about something that was going to happen soon in time to when they were given, within that generation. And so as we now look at them, the fulfillment of those prophecies is long in the past rather than still being in our future. It makes, to my mind, a lot of sense of this passage and a lot of sense of other passages. It means you're no longer trying to find ways to make it all work. It hangs together as one message about one event. I think the problem we have with accepting this is that we Christians, in every generation, we've wanted the Bible to be directly about me and my generation. We want to find current world events in the pages of the Bible. But the primary purpose of Jesus' words here was to prepare that first generation of Christians for all that was about to happen in their world. It's not first and foremost about us and our world, although we will see it has much to say to us. Peter Leithart says, we misconstrue so much of the New Testament if we don't read it in this framework. Untethered from this context, epistles go floating off to the ether, losing their gritty practicality for first century believers and 21st century believers. Well, I'm taking it as Jesus speaking about the events that were about to happen soon within a generation, as in the whole of this passage. Two things that he's saying. The first is this, that Jesus' disciples, those disciples that he's speaking to, that generation, they're going to suffer much, but he will save those who patiently endure. In verse 3, they ask about the sign. What will be the sign of Jesus coming and the end of the age? How will we know when all this is about to happen? And Jesus answered, verse 4, watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, claiming I am the Christ, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you're not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. So Jesus speaks about wars, rumors of wars, conflict, famines, earthquakes, but they're not the signs of the end. That's the point of what he's making. They're not the signs, they're merely the beginning of the birth pains. The baby's not coming for a long time yet. Jesus is not giving them signs, he's warning them not to be led astray. He's saying, look, people are going to come claiming the end is here, and they're going to claim that they're the Christ, and they're going to deceive many. And the historian Josephus says that there were many in that generation between AD 30 and AD 70 who claimed to be Christ coming back again and tried to lead people astray. And Jesus says, verse 4, watch out. And verse 6, don't be alarmed. And then he goes on, verse 9, to talk about how they will be persecuted, and some of them will be put to death, and they'll be hated by all people, and that many, or many Christians will turn away from the faith and turn on each other. In verse 11, there'll be false prophets that will lead Christians astray. In verse 12, there'll be an increase in wickedness, and the love of many Christians will grow cold. All these terrible things happening, but if their thinking is must be the end, Jesus is still saying no. Those are not the signs. Jesus is warning them, don't turn away, don't be deceived. Don't let your love grow cold. Verse 13, stand firm to the end, and you will be saved. Saved in what sense? Well, verse 22 does talk about the days of distress being cut short for the sake of the elect, for those who have been chosen by Christ. So he is saying to them, look, the suffering that you're about to go through and the temptation you're about to go through will be limited. I will limit it for your sake. But mostly they're told to patiently endure. They won't be saved from all persecution, but saved through it. They won't even be saved from death, because it says, verse 9, some of you will be put to death, but you'll be saved through death. You'll be given the strength to keep trusting Christ and to keep preaching Christ throughout the empire as they wait to enter into the fullness of Christ's eternal kingdom. In general, they're not signs then that they can look to, but there is a sign, isn't there? It's there in verse 15. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. The time will have come. But what does the sign mean? What is this abomination that causes desolation? I think we have to hope that they understood what it was. There's been lots of speculation. If this, though, is a first century event that Jesus is talking about, then I think it's likely that he means the killing of Christians as scapegoats by the leaders in Jerusalem as the Roman armies started to close in on that city. To kill those who are Jesus' people is an abomination to the Lord. And it will cause desolation because Jesus will avenge his martyrs and bring desolation on the city that does that to his people. So the Christians were given a sign. And again, Eusebius, the historian, says that many of the Christians did indeed flee Jerusalem at just the right time before the Romans began their last terrible siege of Jerusalem in the late 60s AD. That sign is there, and it proved effective, and it saved those Christians' lives. But overall, the passage, Jesus' focus is not on giving them signs that they can interpret, but on reminding them to patiently endure and not to be misled and not to be deceived. Matthew Henry, writing in the 17th century, said this: "It is observable that what Christ here saith to his disciples tends more to engage their caution than to satisfy their curiosity, more to prepare them for the events that should happen than to give them a distinct idea of the events themselves." Jesus is not telling them very much about what's going to happen, but he's telling them what they need to know so that they can endure whatever is coming their way. Well, in verse 21, Jesus tells us that distress of that happened in those years in the late 60s and through to AD 70, it is greater than anything that we will experience, that anyone will have experienced before or after. Nevertheless, there will be ripples. There will be similar events, similar persecutions, similar trials, all down the ages. At times, it will feel like the end of an age, that everything that we know, that our world is being destroyed. That's happened in the past to Christians in Soviet Union and Cambodia. It is happening today to Christians in Northern Korea and Nigeria. And you may say it feels like the Western world is collapsing all around us now. And maybe the West will collapse and other world powers will rise in our place. Maybe the Western church will collapse and it's people from other nations who will have to come here in the future and disciple our nation for Christ once again. But Jesus hasn't given us the signs. We don't know any of the detail. But he has, in this passage and in other places, given us that encouragement to persevere. Christ has the power to sustain you and me. Stay calm. Don't overreact to what's going on. Don't panic. Be patient. We're to love Christ. We're to love and serve our families in Christ. We're to build for the future, not really knowing what the future holds. Build families, build schools, build businesses, build by faith in Christ with solid hope in him. We may not be saved from suffering or death for Christ's sake, but we will be saved by him through suffering and death if we don't lose our confidence in him. Remember how Jesus said that everyone who hears his words and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. Jesus' disciples will suffer, but he will save those who patiently endure. And then finally, we see that Jesus' enemies, although they will persecute many in that first generation and since, yet Jesus will bring their world crashing down. Jesus' little story continues. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. That's exactly what was happening in Jerusalem. Those who heeded Christ's words were able to flee from the city at the right time, but the persecuting city, Jesus says, will be destroyed. Verse 27, for as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. We've already looked at what that means. Christ comes on the clouds to the Ancient of Days, and he's given all authority. But what is this sign that's spoken about in verse 30? What is this sign seen by the people on earth? Some have said it is actually talking about a sign in the sky. The word is translated sky, but it could mean heaven. Seeing a sign in the sky of Jesus' ascension and his enthronement. But actually that verse 30, could be translated as a sign on earth of the Son of Man who is in heaven. Well, what sign would people see on earth that would tell them that Christ is now at the Father's right hand, seeing as we can't see him there? Isn't it the destruction of the city? Because that's what Jesus had promised he would do. If he's now at the Father's right hand, then the sign that he's at the Father's right hand and has been given all power and authority is the coming to pass of the very thing that he said would happen. You see, the false Christs that are spoken about in verse 24, they make wild claims, they even work miracles, but they don't have the power and authority of Christ. The coming of the true Christ into his kingdom is unmistakable. He rides into heaven as the crown, to be crowned as king. And the smoking ruin of Jerusalem will be the unmistakable evidence and sign. His words will be vindicated. Every word that he's spoken proves true. Verse 34, I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. For Jerusalem, her judgment is near. For the Christians, it was their deliverance, their salvation that was near, as their chief oppressor was destroyed. And so the word to them and to us is not to be afraid. Christ will bring all powers and authorities to bow the knee to him. He will work out his purposes. There will, at some point, be a faithful church in England that disciples this nation for Christ. Maybe it will include a reformed and renewed and repentant Church of England, or maybe we'll be swept aside and Christ will build his church in another way. We don't need to fear the bishops, the church authorities. We don't need to fear the government. We don't need to fear dark, secular or satanic forces. We need to trust Christ's power and his word. When worlds come to an end, it is because Christ is working out his purposes for our benefit as his people and for his great glory. Jesus will be vindicated. He says his disciples will stand firm and be saved, and his enemies will be brought down. And so the lesson for them and the message to us is to patiently trust Christ, to believe his word, to endure, to obey, and to work in hope with confidence in Christ and his power. Let's pray.